This is solo audio podcast, no entertainment, no 30 seconds quick fix or hacks. So what does material logic actually look like when it stops being abstract theory and starts running Amazon warehouses? We've explored structural compulsion, competitive imperatives, systemic contradictions. But how do these invisible forces manifest in actual boardrooms, family offices, and delivery trucks racing against algorithmic timers? Picture this: you're watching a billion-dollar decision unfold. The executives speak of strategy, innovation, market positioning. But beneath their words, deeper currents are flowing, forces that would compel the same decisions regardless of who sits in those leather chairs. Today, we peer behind the curtain of corporate power to witness material logic in its natural habitat. Operating through flesh and blood institutions that seem to make choices, but actually respond to structural imperatives as predictable as gravity. From Amazon's systematic union-crushing machine to the Walton family's dynastic wealth preservation empire, these aren't random examples of corporate misbehavior. They're case studies in how abstract forces crystallize into concrete practices, patterns so consistent you could almost set your watch by them. Business journalism runs on a simple formula: turn every structural force into a CEO biography. When Amazon faces union organizing drives, coverage zeroes in on leadership attitudes toward labor, as if Jeff Bezos or Andy Jassy personally invented worker surveillance. When the Walton family's wealth swells by another $50 billion, articles celebrate individual philanthropy rather than examining the systematic mechanisms that concentrate such astronomical sums. This personalization acts like a magic trick, transforming systemic outcomes into individual moral choices. It's like blaming a single raindrop for causing a flood, technically accurate in the narrowest sense, but missing the meteorological systems that made the deluge inevitable. Rather than analyzing how competitive imperatives necessitate worker suppression, we debate whether particular executives wake up feeling anti-union. Instead of examining how estate planning structures preserve dynastic control across generations, we celebrate or criticize individual charitable donations. The result: every structural problem gets reframed as a leadership problem, waiting for the right visionary to solve it through better personal choices. The mainstream narrative suggests corporate behavior flows from leadership vision and personal values. Amazon's workplace practices supposedly reflect particular management philosophies, while the Walton family's wealth preservation demonstrates exceptional business acumen rather than systematic exploitation of legal loopholes designed for exactly this purpose. This framework obscures a troubling pattern. When similar practices emerge across multiple corporations and industries, individual agency explanations start breaking down. Why do tech companies from different founders, with different stated values, end up deploying nearly identical surveillance technologies? Why do wealthy families across continents utilize remarkably similar tax avoidance structures? The pattern suggests systematic rather than personal causation. But acknowledging systematic forces threatens the comfortable illusion that better individuals can solve structural problems. So the personalization machine keeps grinding, turning every predictable outcome into a surprising personal choice. The personalization framework generates endless faith in reform through enlightened leadership. If corporate problems stem from individual choices, then better individuals can solve them. This creates perpetual cycles of hoping for ethical executives who will voluntarily reform exploitative practices, the business equivalent of waiting for benevolent dictators. But this hope consistently crashes against structural reality. Even well-intentioned leaders discover that competitive pressures constrain ethical choices. Evidence suggests the system rewards conformity to accumulation imperatives, while systematically eliminating leaders who prioritize worker welfare or environmental protection over profit maximization. The graveyard of conscious capitalism initiatives is littered with executives who learned this lesson the hard way. Yet each failure only reinforces the cycle. If this leader couldn't reform the system, surely the next one will have stronger character, clearer vision, more sophisticated ethics. The structure remains invisible, protected by our faith in individual agency. Let's go deeper into how material logic operates through Amazon's systematic approach to preventing worker organization. In November 2024, the National Labor Relations Board didn't just rule against Amazon. They documented a union suppression apparatus so comprehensive it resembles an industrial process. The NLRB found that Amazon's captive audience meetings, where workers are compelled to attend anti-union sessions under threat of discipline, violate federal labor law. But this was just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Administrative Law Judge Lauren Esposito's November 2024 decision documented violations that read like a surveillance state manual. Systematic monitoring of union supporters, selective discipline targeting organizers, and mandatory propaganda sessions designed to break collective solidarity. As of January 2025, NLRB regional offices had processed nearly 350 open or settled unfair labor practice charges against Amazon across 27 states. One of the most comprehensive patterns of labor law violations documented by federal regulators. The scale isn't accidental, it's industrial. Here's where structure reveals its teeth. Amazon's union resistance doesn't stem from personal animosity toward workers. It follows the iron logic of competitive capitalism. Unionized workers demand higher wages, better working conditions, constraints on productivity increases. Every concession increases costs relative to non-unionized competitors. In ruthlessly competitive markets, these cost disadvantages can prove fatal to business survival. Consider the numbers. Over 60 million non-union private sector workers are trapped in mandatory arbitration clauses, which research from the National Employment Law Project shows enabled employers to pocket over $9.2 billion in stolen wages from low-paid workers in 2019 alone. Amazon's resistance appears not as corporate cruelty, but as structural adaptation. Every dollar spent enhancing working conditions is a dollar unavailable for price competition, technological investment, or market expansion. The logic is brutally simple: suppress worker organization or face competitive elimination. Individual executives may feel uncomfortable with surveillance technologies, but the system rewards those who deploy them effectively while punishing those who don't. Amazon has perfected what researchers term algorithmic management, comprehensive digital surveillance that makes traditional workplace control look primitive by comparison. The company deploys tracking devices, workstation displays, and mobile applications not just for productivity monitoring, but for total workplace control. Workers report feeling like they're trapped inside a machine that watches their every movement, times their bathroom breaks, and flags them for underperformance based on metrics that require superhuman endurance. A 2023 University of Illinois Chicago survey of 1,484 Amazon warehouse workers revealed that 41% reported injuries, rising to 51% among workers employed for more than 3 years. The pattern suggests systematic intensification of workplace pressure rather than random accidents. Meanwhile, investigative journalism from Time documented how AI systems marketed as revolutionary innovations depend on millions of workers paid as little as $1 and 50 cents per hour for data labeling and content moderation. The hidden human substrate of technological transformation. This represents capitalism's adaptive evolution. Where previous generations used physical intimidation and termination to control workers, contemporary capital deploys algorithmic surveillance that makes resistance nearly impossible to organize. That pressure we've been examining, let's see how it plays out at the very top of the wealth pyramid. The Walton family's net worth reached $432 billion in December 2024, though by May 2025, it had adjusted to approximately $353 billion, still more than the GDP of most countries. Two Walmart heirs, Jim and Rob Walton, became the first siblings to each exceed $100 billion in individual wealth. Through family entities, three siblings control approximately 3 billion shares, representing 37.45% of Walmart's roughly 8 billion outstanding shares. But here's what makes this more than just a big number. This wealth concentration operates through sophisticated legal architectures designed to preserve family control while optimizing tax obligations across generations. Sam Walton didn't just build a retail empire. He constructed a dynastic wealth preservation machine through family partnerships that ensure unified control over Walmart's strategic direction regardless of which generation holds formal power. The scale transforms individual wealth into systematic economic control, affecting global supply chains, millions of workers, and entire regions through private family decisions made in boardrooms without electoral accountability. The Walton family's wealth preservation demonstrates how legal structures function as class reproduction technologies. Sam Walton structured his estate through family partnerships, where Helen inherited his portion tax-free through marital deduction provisions. These mechanisms enable massive wealth transfers without triggering estate tax obligations that would devastate ordinary inheritances. Recent governance changes expanded voting rights to 8 of Sam's grandchildren, growing decision-making from 3 to 11 family members while maintaining concentrated control. This apparent democratization actually strengthens centralized wealth management by distributing formal participation while preserving unified strategic direction. IRS data shows wealthy families utilized $20.9 billion in specialized Jackie O trusts in 2011. Sophisticated legal structures that would be cost-prohibitive for middle-class families, but provide enormous advantages at billionaire scales. The genius lies in making dynastic power appear democratic, while ensuring it remains firmly controlled by inherited wealth rather than earned achievement or electoral mandate. Through family entities controlling 37.45% of Walmart's 8 billion shares, the Walton siblings wield decisive influence over corporate strategy while operating through formal democratic governance structures. This ownership concentration enables wealth extraction through dividends while maintaining strategic control over labor relations, supplier negotiations, and competitive positioning across global markets. The democratic implications are staggering. The Walton family's private economic decision-making affects millions of workers and consumers globally, yet operates without electoral accountability or democratic oversight. Their family meetings carry more economic consequence than most government policy decisions, with private strategic choices affecting global supply chains and entire regional economies. When private wealth concentration reaches this scale, it transforms from individual fortune into private economic governance, a parallel power structure that shapes social outcomes through market mechanisms rather than democratic institutions. Here's a thought experiment that reveals how material logic operates, even when individuals try to resist it. Let me introduce you to Sarah, a fictional tech entrepreneur who launched a social media platform prioritizing user privacy over data monetization. Her platform used subscription revenue rather than surveillance capitalism, paid content moderators living wages instead of exploiting gig workers, and maintained transparent algorithms rather than engagement manipulation designed to maximize addiction. These ethical commitments created fundamental cost disadvantages against Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, platforms that could offer free services by harvesting user data and exploiting unpaid labor. Harvard Business School research confirms that 90% of startups fail, with ethical considerations playing significant roles in these failures. Venture capital firms consistently rejected Sarah's funding requests because the business model prioritized user welfare over maximum extraction. Without surveillance-based advertising revenue, the platform couldn't achieve the user acquisition costs necessary to compete for attention in saturated digital markets. The market systematically selected against ethical practices through price competition, exactly as material logic predicts. Within 18 months, Sarah's platform faced massive user defection to competitors offering free services subsidized by data harvesting. Individual users made rational choices, selecting zero-cost platforms over subscription models, creating collective outcomes that undermined privacy and worker welfare. The invisible hand of the market systematically crushed ethical innovation. BIP Ventures documented a loss of ethical perspective among Silicon Valley venture capital firms, particularly evident in high-profile cases like FTX and the Ranos, where growth at all costs mentality systematically disadvantaged companies prioritizing social responsibility. Sarah's platform closure wasn't due to inferior technology or poor management, but structural disadvantages created by capitalism's relentless cost optimization imperatives. Every ethical business model faces the same challenge: compete against companies willing to externalize social and environmental costs or face systematic elimination. The market doesn't reward virtue, it punishes it through competitive disadvantage. Sarah's experience represents a universal pattern where markets reward cost minimization while creating systematic challenges for ethical practices. Every business operating under ethical constraints faces higher costs than competitors willing to externalize social and environmental damage onto society. This creates what economists euphemistically call competitive disadvantages, though it might be more accurate to describe it as systematic punishment for social responsibility. The pattern extends across industries and scales. Ethical manufacturers face cost disadvantages against sweatshop competitors. Sustainable agriculture competes against industrial operations that dump environmental costs on future generations. Worker-owned cooperatives struggle against corporations that suppress wages and benefits. Time's investigation revealed that AI systems marketed as revolutionary depend on millions of workers paid as little as $1 and 50 cents per hour for data labeling. The hidden cost structure underlying technological transformation. Material logic ensures that virtue becomes a luxury the market systematically eliminates through competitive pressure. The system doesn't just fail to reward ethical behavior, it actively selects against it. Let me tell you about Miguel, who works at a distribution center outside Phoenix earning $16 per hour sorting packages for online retailers. Company policies promise reasonable break times and productivity targets, but algorithmic management systems track his every movement, bathroom break, and processing speed. The system automatically flags him for underperformance if productivity drops below rates that require limiting bathroom breaks and skipping lunch periods. When Miguel attempts to organize coworkers around basic safety concerns and bathroom access, he discovers the same systematic retaliation documented by NLRB Administrative Law Judge Lauren Esposito. Colleagues disappear under performance improvement programs immediately after voicing safety concerns, work assignments change mysteriously, and supervision intensifies for anyone showing union sympathy. Miguel's situation mirrors Amazon warehouse conditions, but operates at countless smaller facilities across the country where workers face identical pressures with even fewer legal protections. The pattern isn't confined to tech giants. It's replicated wherever competitive pressure meets worker organization. Miguel's employer faces competitive pressures from companies willing to push workers harder through more intensive surveillance and productivity requirements. If Miguel's facility provided significantly enhanced working conditions, clients might shift contracts to competitors offering lower costs through worker intensification. Miguel experiences material logic as constrained choice. He can select between different jobs, but cannot choose whether competitive pressure occurs. OSHA compliance analysis reveals the systematic nature of this pressure. Overall employer compliance with federal reporting requirements for work-related amputations reached only 42.1%, with compliance dropping to 14.6% in agriculture, 20.7% in retail trade, and 13% in accommodation and food services. These aren't random failures, but predictable outcomes of cost-cutting pressure that treats worker safety as expendable overhead. Miguel faces a system where individual agency operates within parameters defined by structural competitive forces that make worker welfare systematically expendable to cost minimization. When Miguel and coworkers discuss organizing, they confront structural barriers documented at Amazon and major employers nationwide. Union organizing requires individual workers to risk retaliation for collective benefits that may never materialize. The asymmetric power relationship means employers can impose consequences on individual workers, while workers cannot impose individual consequences on employers. Yet Miguel's situation also reveals potential for collective response to systematic problems. Research demonstrates that unionized employers achieved 92.7% OSHA compliance compared to 18.2% for small employers. A dramatic difference suggesting collective action's effectiveness against structural pressure. Recent strikes at Amazon, Starbucks, and other major employers show workers recognizing common patterns across different companies and beginning to target structural rather than individual causes. The key insight: individual virtue faces systematic limitations, but collective action can challenge the structural forces that create predictable patterns of exploitation across different employers and contexts. Consider two inheritance stories that operate through identical legal mechanisms, but create qualitatively different social relations. The Johnson family represents middle-class wealth accumulation. Parents who worked 40 years, saved diligently, and accumulated $800,000 in retirement assets. When both die, their children inherit $400,000 each after estate expenses, genuine sacrifice and prudent planning, providing meaningful advantages through education funding and home down payments. This inheritance enables class mobility within existing structures. Now contrast this with documented Walton inheritance patterns. Offspring wealth totaling $337 billion provides economic power exceeding most nation-states. Both inheritances operate through similar legal mechanisms, but quantitative differences create qualitatively different social relations. The Johnson inheritance provides individual opportunity. Walton inheritance enables structural control over the economic conditions that determine whether opportunities exist for others. Same legal system, radically different social outcomes, the hallmark of systematic rather than individual causation. The same estate planning techniques available to the Johnsons, family trusts, tax optimization, strategic gifting, operate at vastly different scales for dynastic wealth preservation. Congressional Budget Office analysis shows that estate tax changes in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced federal revenues by projected $83 billion from 2018 to 2027, with temporary doubling of estate tax exemption reducing taxable estates by more than half. London School of Economics analysis using French administrative data, revealed that effective inheritance tax rates for the top 0.1% reach just under 10%, far below the 45% nominal rate, through sophisticated legal structures enabling systematic tax avoidance. The law appears equal, but operates differently based on wealth concentration, revealing how apparently neutral legal frameworks systematically advantage extreme accumulation. What looks like legal equality actually functions as systematic inequality through differential access to sophisticated legal structures that would be cost-prohibitive for ordinary families, but provide enormous advantages at billionaire scales. The Johnson inheritance affects extended family and local community through spending patterns and civic participation, individual wealth creating individual opportunity. The Walton inheritance affects global supply chains, millions of workers, and entire regional economies through private corporate strategic decisions, individual wealth creating systematic economic control. Both operate through private family decision-making without democratic accountability, but at different scales with qualitatively different social implications. Institute for Policy Studies research documents that 136 of the 400 wealthiest Americans derive wealth from companies started by earlier generations, with dynastic families using their considerable wealth and power to influence the rules of the economy to protect and expand their wealth and power. When private wealth concentration reaches sufficient scale, it transforms from individual privilege into private economic governance, exercised through market mechanisms that affect millions without democratic mandate or accountability. The Amazon union suppression apparatus, Walton wealth concentration machinery, failed ethical startup elimination, and everyday workplace surveillance represent variations on identical themes rather than separate phenomena. Each demonstrates how competitive imperatives override individual preferences, how legal structures systematically advantage capital accumulation over social welfare, and how market mechanisms create predictable challenges for socially beneficial practices. Once you recognize these connecting threads, Amazon's 350 NLRB charges across 27 states, the Walton family's $353 billion concentration through legal optimization structures, competitive pressure systematically eliminating ethical business models, algorithmic surveillance replicating documented patterns across facilities, the systematic nature becomes undeniable. These aren't isolated corporate behaviors, but predictable outcomes of structural forces operating through different scales and contexts with mathematical consistency. The research drawing from over 180 peer-reviewed sources, government archives, and institutional publications validates these patterns across industries, time periods, and geographic contexts. Material logic operates with machine-like precision. The case studies reveal material logic operating through human agents who appear to make choices, but actually respond to structural constraints as predictable as physical laws. Amazon executives don't suppress unions due to personal anti-worker sentiment. They respond to competitive pressures that reward labor cost minimization while punishing companies that enhance worker welfare. The Walton family doesn't concentrate wealth through personal greed. They utilize legal structures that systematically preserve economic power across generations regardless of individual family members' charitable inclinations. Understanding these patterns requires analytical focus shift from individual moral evaluation to structural contradiction analysis. The significant question isn't whether particular executives possess ethical character, but how systematic imperatives create predictable behavioral patterns regardless of individual intentions, values, or personal backgrounds. The research consistently demonstrates these patterns across multiple corporations, industrial sectors, and historical periods. Individual agency operates within structural parameters that make certain outcomes nearly inevitable, while making others systematically disadvantaged through competitive elimination. Each case study demonstrates systematic limitations of expecting individual virtue to overcome structural imperatives embedded in competitive capitalism. Ethical executives at Amazon would face competitive elimination by companies willing to suppress unions more effectively through comprehensive surveillance and retaliation. Generous Walton family members still operate within legal frameworks that preserve dynastic advantages regardless of personal charitable giving or moral intentions. The systematic nature of these contradictions explains why decades of corporate social responsibility initiatives, ethical business education programs, and moral appeals to wealthy elites have failed to significantly reduce inequality, improve working conditions, or address environmental destruction. Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy data shows only 8 of every 10,000 people who died in 2019 left estates large enough to trigger estate tax, while ultra-wealthy families utilize sophisticated avoidance mechanisms that almost exclusively benefit the top of the inherited wealth distribution. Individual conscience consistently encounters systematic constraints that reward conformity to accumulation imperatives, while eliminating those who prioritize social welfare over profit maximization. Tax-subsidized charitable foundations enable the Walton family to influence social policy priorities without electoral accountability, while reducing tax obligations through public subsidy. The Walton Family Foundation distributes hundreds of millions annually in education and environmental grants. But these philanthropic activities operate through substantial taxpayer subsidy, tax deductions that shift the financial burden to ordinary taxpayers while enabling private policy influence. This creates perverse democratic dynamics where private wealth concentration enables policy influence that might otherwise flow through representative institutions. Foundation priorities reflect family preferences rather than democratic deliberation, yet operate through public resources diverted from collective decision-making processes. The stepped-up basis provision allows heirs to avoid capital gains taxes on inherited assets by resetting cost basis to asset value at death. Another public subsidy for dynastic wealth preservation. Democracy subsidizes its own democratic deficit through tax structures that enable private wealth to exercise public policy influence without electoral accountability or democratic mandate. During COVID-19, while millions of working families faced unemployment, eviction, and medical bankruptcy, the Walton family's wealth increased by $172.7 billion through an 80% increase in Walmart stock prices. The crisis that devastated ordinary workers provided massive windfall returns to the ownership class through increased consumer demand for essential goods and services dominated by their corporate holdings. This pattern reveals how crises systematically advantage capital ownership over labor, income through what researchers term disaster capitalism. The transformation of collective tragedy into private profit opportunity. International Labor Organization analysis estimates that 136 million health and social workers globally faced pandemic risks with inadequate safety measures, while capital owners captured extraordinary returns through ownership claims on increased economic activity generated by essential worker labor. Crises don't suspend material logic. They intensify it, accelerating wealth concentration while devastating those who create the value being concentrated. 8 of Sam Walton's grandchildren now participate in family investment decisions, ensuring dynastic economic control continues into the 4th generation. These young adults, born into extreme wealth concentration, will exercise economic power over millions of workers and consumers without democratic mandate or accountability to those affected by their private strategic decisions. The reproduction of class power through inheritance creates what researchers term democratic capitalism with hereditary characteristics. Formal democratic institutions coexisting with hereditary economic control that operates through market mechanisms rather than political appointment. Economic research analysis of founding family-controlled firms reveals how ownership concentration above approximately 38% enables controlling families to extract wealth from minority shareholders. A dynamic the Walton structure exemplifies on massive scale. Democracy becomes formal political equality, coexisting with substantive economic inequality that reproduces across generations through inherited rather than earned power. The Amazon union suppression apparatus, Walton wealth concentration machinery, startup elimination processes, and everyday workplace surveillance demonstrate variations on identical systematic themes rather than separate phenomena. Each case reveals how competitive imperatives override individual preferences, how legal structures systematically advantage capital accumulation over social welfare, and how market mechanisms create predictable challenges for socially beneficial practices through what operates like a social selection mechanism. Comprehensive literature review, drawing from over 180 peer-reviewed sources, government archives, and institutional publications, validates these systematic patterns across different scales and contexts. From Amazon's 350 NLRB charges across 27 states to the Walton family's $353 billion concentration through sophisticated legal structures, the evidence demonstrates predictable outcomes of structural forces operating with machine-like consistency, regardless of individual personalities, stated values, or moral intentions. Like gravity shaping planetary motion, material logic shapes corporate behavior through structural forces that operate independently of individual agency while appearing to flow from personal choices. The case studies reveal material logic operating through human agents who appear to make autonomous choices, but actually respond to structural constraints as predictable as natural laws. Amazon executives respond to competitive pressures that reward labor cost minimization while systematically eliminating companies that prioritize worker welfare over profit maximization. The Walton family utilizes legal structures that systematically preserve economic power across generations through mechanisms designed for exactly this purpose. Understanding these patterns requires analytical focus shift from individual moral evaluation to structural contradiction analysis that examines how systematic imperatives create predictable behavioral patterns regardless of individual intentions, values, or ethical commitments. The research consistently demonstrates these patterns across multiple corporations, industrial sectors, historical periods, and geographic contexts, suggesting systematic rather than individual causation. The significant insight, what appears as corporate choice, actually represents structural response to competitive imperatives embedded in capitalism's basic operational requirements for survival and accumulation. Each case study demonstrates systematic limitations of expecting individual virtue to overcome structural imperatives embedded in competitive capitalism's basic operational logic. Ethical executives at Amazon would face competitive elimination by companies willing to suppress unions more effectively through comprehensive surveillance, retaliation, and legal manipulation. Generous Walton family members still operate within legal frameworks that preserve dynastic advantages regardless of personal charitable giving, moral education, or stated social commitments. The systematic nature of these contradictions explains why decades of corporate social responsibility initiatives, ethical business education programs, and moral appeals to wealthy elites have failed to significantly reduce inequality, improve working conditions, or address environmental destruction. Case studies consistently demonstrate that individual virtue encounters systematic constraints that reward conformity to accumulation imperatives, while eliminating those who prioritize social welfare over profit maximization through competitive pressure. The concrete examples demonstrate abstract theoretical concepts operating through flesh and blood institutions with mathematical precision. Material logic isn't philosophical abstraction, but observable patterns connecting Amazon's union suppression apparatus, the Walton family's wealth concentration machinery, startup elimination processes, and everyday workplace surveillance across scales and contexts. Understanding these patterns requires moving beyond personalized explanations toward systematic analysis of how capitalist competition creates predictable outcomes regardless of individual intentions, moral commitments, or personal values. The cases reveal that corporate choices actually represent structural responses to competitive imperatives embedded in the system's basic operational requirements for survival and accumulation. The empirical evidence validates Marx's crisis theory through recurring patterns of overaccumulation, spatial fixes, and temporal displacement that operate independently of individual decisions while appearing to flow from personal choices. What we witness isn't corporate misbehavior, but structural logic expressing itself through institutional forms that seem autonomous, but actually respond to systematic forces as predictable as gravity shaping planetary motion. Episode 5 will examine how these structural forces evolve and adapt to changing technological, environmental, and social conditions, exploring future trajectories of material logic in an era of artificial intelligence, climate crisis, and emerging forms of resistance that threaten to disrupt the patterns we've been analyzing. Until then, stay safe and stay engaged.